All right. What's up, everyone? So this is a voiceover league. This is getting recorded before the ManaTraders event with the list I'm going to be playing in the ManaTraders event, but I'm not going to be able to post this video until after the ManaTraders event. So this is kind of like a sneak preview of some of the testing that went into coming up with the list to play at the ManaTraders. So let's go over the list real quick. Obviously, this is Dimir, mURktide, Shadow. It's the deck I've chosen to register for the ManaTraders based on having some pretty consistent results, consistent 3-2s and 4-1s in the leagues over the past week, plus a trophy in there somewhere. So it's felt like a list that had a solid foundation to it that I could tweak a little bit and kind of get some of the results I was looking for. I'm really keyed in on seeing like Amulet Titan, Blue-Red mURktide, Rhinos, and so I want something that's got a little bit of a game against all three of those. In the main deck, not too much has changed in the last few months. I did decide to cut the second copy of Dismember for the first copy of Blood Chief's Thirst. Give a little extra answer for some Planeswalkers like Wrenn 6 to Fairy, as well as some of the big things like mURktide that can come down later, and being a 1-mana answer to Ragavan, which is huge. Ragavan, I think, is like the biggest detriment to this deck because it allows your opponent to get under what's often a very limited amount of 1-mana interaction from us, create a mana advantage that allows your opponent to double spell when we're often not equipped to double spell in the early turns. We're often holding up like one piece of counter magic, one piece of interaction. So Ragavan, definitely not something you want sitting around on the field. It is sorcery speed, so it's a little unfortunate against a dashed Ragavan. But by the time dashing a Ragavan becomes relevant, hopefully we're able to hold up counter magic instead. Otherwise, in the main deck, a lot of 4-ofs, 4 Consider, 4 Shadow, 4 Fatal Push, 4 Thoughtseize, 4 Drown, 4 Counterspell, 4 Street Wraith, 4 mURktide, 3 Archmage's Charms. You could go up to the 4th if you wanted, but I've been pretty happy with just like 2 or 3 is kind of our top end. Brazen Borrower, really good in testing, bouncing everything from like Blood Moons to opposing mURktides, troublesome Planeswalkers. Could see going up to a second one of those in the 75. 1 Dismember, additional 1 mana removal spell. Dress down, 2 Spell Pierce over the 2. We had 2 Stubborn Denial in that spot earlier. Swap to 2 Spell Pierce just to be able to better answer like early Planeswalkers, as well as like 1 mana interaction things when your opponent's got 2 mana up. Really useful against like mURktide and stuff. In the sideboard, we upped the count on a lot of pieces to try to see them more often. 3 copies of Flusterstorm for creativity, mURktide, Rhinos, Living End, anything like that. 2 copies of Dress Down to go along with the one in the main for any annoying ETB effects, for Sanctifier on Vec, Shrink opposing mURktides, anything like that. 3 Spreading Seas, Amulet Titan, Tron, the greedy 4-color, 5-color Omnath piles, Leyline Binding decks have trouble with Spreading Seas. 1 Mystical Dispute, little flex catch-all for everything from Teferi, mURktide, Ledger Shredder, Expressive Iteration, Omnath. 3 Ultimate Price. Definitely the oddball out over here. If you don't know this card, it's 1 and a black, destroy target mono-colored creature. So we had to do a really big question of what this hits and misses. We've been playing Infernal Grasp, which is 1 and a black, destroy target creature, lose 2 life. But there's been a huge uptick in like prowess decks recently, and the life loss can be very, very relevant when you're also looking at life loss off of your fetches and shocks, Thoughtseize, Street Wraith. So I really wanted like a painless way to kill something. We took a look at every 2 mana or less destroy a creature spell we could find. And some of the top contenders were like the one that destroys a non-legendary creature. But ultimately, like, let me pull up Goldfish real quick. And you can kind of see where the thought process came from. Alright, so there's the destroy a creature with no counters on it. Destroy a... there's a bunch of, like, destroy a creature CMC 3 or less or something like that. There's the 1 mana destroy a creature with total combined power, toughness 5 or less. There is Infernal Grasp, a bunch of stuff like that. So, like, against mURktide, Infernal Grasp hits everything at the cost of 2 life. Ultimate Price hits everything. The destroy something with no counters on it can miss mURktide or Ledger Shredder, which is really, really bad for your removal spell you're boarding in against this deck. And then the destroy something combined power and toughness 5 or less. Doesn't even hit like a Dragon's Rage Channeler with Delirium, so that's immediately out the window. Doesn't hit a Ledger Shredder with 1 counter on it, so that's definitely out the window. The destroy CMC 3 or less stuff like Smother doesn't hit mURktide, so that's pretty bad to bring in against mURktide. To destroy a non-legendary creature doesn't hit Ragavan. Why did I close out that window? We go down the list. We'll figure this out. We go down the list of modern decks. It's like, all right, monocolored hits everything in creativity because all you're really targeting is like dwarf tokens and then the occasional Archon. Hits everything in Hammer Time, everything in Rakdos midrange except Kroxa if they're running that. If they're not running Kroxa, then it hits everything. Hits everything in Footfalls except for Shardless Agent, but honestly, you don't really care about a Shardless Agent being on the board, like a 3 mana 2/2. Sure. You got it. Omnath, it misses Omnath itself, but we still get like Fatal Push. It misses Ice Fang Coatl, but it hits all of the pitch elementals, misses Kahira. But most of that stuff is fine. Like, the big things are you want to be able to kill, like, Fury. You should be countering Omnath if you can, countering Solitude. So, but that's not really like a matchup. It's Super 4. Hits everything in Amulet Titan, unless they're playing Hydroid Krasis, but Fatal Push hits Krasis. Hits everything in Burn. Hits everything except for Hapatra in Yawgmoth, but that's not a auto-inclusion by any means. The generic Ragavan decks, it hits everything unless they're playing third class or Iconoclast, third path Iconoclast. Yeah, it doesn't hit that, but again, you've got like Fatal Push. Hits everything in Mill. Countering Living End against Living End itself. Doesn't hit Kavu against Zoo. See some of these Cascade lists with like Bloodbraid and Malira, and obviously that's a lot worse for Ultimate Price, but I think the more common list, the like Scion list, it doesn't hit Kavu, and that's about it. Doesn't hit Scion of Draco because it's not colored. Everything in Merfolk. So for the most part, it hits everything except like Omnath, Kroxa, and yeah, Omnath, Kroxa, Kavu, Kahira. It's everything else though. So decided to give it a shot. 2 Chalice of the Void for the Cascade decks, and then an EE to wipe up against like Rhinos, Hammer Time, any sort of little creature deck like that. So that's the list we're running with. A couple notes that people have asked about in like the Discord is why no basic swamp? And the reason for that is because these cards need heavy, heavy blue. And you never, I will repeat this until the day I die, so make sure you're hearing me. You never want to be in a position where you cannot cast these cards on curve because you have a basic swamp. Like, I will lose to Blood Moon 1,000 times over before I say you want basic swamp in this deck. And I feel I cannot emphasize that enough. Like, the way you lose games with this deck is not being able to, like, Archmage's Charm on 3, or mURktide plus Counterspell on 4, or mURktide plus Archmage's Charm on 5. As soon as you start losing the ability to do those things, you are done. You have to take extra turns off to get your spells down. You can't play your threats with protection. The game is lost for you. Please, 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 please do not throw basic swamp in there just because you want to run basic swamp. If you accept the risks and say, hey, I would rather have that extra couple percentage against Blood Moon rather than have all of my spells consistently castable on curve, then I am taking that risk and I'm running with it. But I'm telling you, I've played a lot of games with this deck. I really, 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 truly believe you do not want the basic swamp in it. But I can't control what you do. If you want to go for it, know that I've given my 2 cents. I do think that if you're running like the Ledger Shredder, Mishra's Bauble versions, basic swamp is a little bit better because you're a little less reliant on needing a whole bunch of blue. Mainly because you've got threats you can get out a little earlier and then hold up mana after that. Buy yourself a little extra time. But I personally don't really enjoy those lists. I don't think they do what I want to do. So in this kind of list, please don't throw the basic swamp in there. But that's it. So let's jump into the matches. And we'll see what the list is running like. All right. So match number 1. We can get this out of here since we don't have a chat window. The first hand was no land. Second hand, it's not great, but we're on the play. We've got 1 mana interaction. We've got Archmage's Charm to help us kind of get back in a little bit. So we can keep it. Just throw back like one of these lands we don't need. Could throw back the island. I kind of like throwing back the Watery Grave in case I want to make a painless land drop. If I'm up against like Burn or something, I would rather throw back like one of the fetch lands or the shock land. So the shock land's like a little bit of a medium there. It's, hey, if I'm up against Burn, I can fetch up a tapped shock land. If I'm up against something else, then I can be more aggressive. All right, so we're up against Rhinos. Drown in the Loch, really good to draw because it's going to counter Crashing Footfalls even if they have like an Endurance. And we don't really care if they like Fire and Isis, because we'll still have counter magic up on their turn. We really want them to go for like a Shardless Agent on their main phase so we can like go ahead and use a bunch of our mana. What we don't want to see is Violent Outburst on our turn into untap another Cascade spell. And fetch there, because if they do cast like a Violent Outburst in response, then I'm covered. And then Spell Pierce, extremely good pickup there, because this is going to allow me to double spell or double counter. Which is the whole reason I'm firing off this Archmage's Charm now, is like, I don't want to have to kick a Blood Chief's Thirst to get the Brazen Bar off the board. If they go for a Cascade spell on their turn, I've got Spell Pierce. And then I've got Drown in the Lock for the Rhinos next turn. If I had not drawn the Spell Pierce, I would not have gone for countering that Brazen Borrower. All right, so we see hand of double Dead and Gone, double Fury, and a Fire and Ice. So we take the Fire and Ice because it's the only thing that like kind of disrupts us and redraws. We don't have any threats, so we don't really care about the Dead and Gone yet. Like, they're annoying when we get there, but at the moment, they're not doing anything. But the important thing is they don't have a Force of Negation to protect this Footfalls. So we can just get that off the board. And now we've got the 2 Rhinos covered. So we're just kind of buying time until we're able to find a threat. Another Thoughtseize is solid. So they picked up 3rd copy of Fury. So let's just go ahead and take one of those. So we know double Dead and Gone, double Fury. We do want to make sure that the first Fury they cast, if they hit their land drop here, we want to counterspell the first Fury, because if we let it resolve and then go to our turn and Blood Chief's Thirst, if we don't hit the 6th land, we can't hold up counterspell. So we would end up like kicking a Thirst, killing a Rhino, or killing a Fury, and then not being able to counter the second one. That would put us in a little bit of a bind. Opponent top decks an Outburst, but we've got a counter spell. So like right here, this first Rhino, we need to make sure we counter spell, so when they resolve the second Rhino, we can Blood Chief's Thirst. All right. So playing out this this mURktide, I'm playing this one as a 5/5. I could make it bigger, but I know that they've got multiple copies of Dead and Gone in hand, and they've got a Fury. So I don't want them to be able to kill my mURktide with a hard cast Fury, but I also don't want to put myself in a position where I exile like all of my graveyard and they gone my mURktide and I'm just kind of left with nothing. Obviously, if they had like a land and could Fury hardcast Fury and cast a Dead on the mURktide, that would be unfortunate. But I'm kind of banking on them not flooding out super hard. So let's Blood Chief's Thirst, kill that. There's the 4th copy of Footfalls on suspend. They do let me untap, which they should not do. They should gone on their turn, not let me untap with mana, because if I have a counter spell and I can counter this this gone, it's pretty bad for them. So again, we're just gonna make a not exile everything mURktide, because we know they have another Dead and Gone. I just want to be able to recast the mURktide at some point at a reasonable size. Yeah. Don't feel like I need to fire off this dress down yet. And now that I've found a counter spell, I'm 100% making an 8/8 mURktide. 1 turn clock. I've got a counter backup. Yep. Pretty easy, easy choice there. All right. So opponent scoops it up there. I guess they figure we've got a counter spell at that point. On to game number 2. Sideboarding against mURktide. Boarding out the dress down, the brazen borrower. The dress down because, like, hitting a fury is fine, but once it gets like hard cast fury territory, then I feel reasonably ahead and I don't really need to like stifle that ability. And I don't have enough early plays to where I feel I need to stop an evoked fury. A mURktide comes out because with all of the like dead and gones, brazen borrowers, stuff like that, I don't want my mURktide to get bounced over and over again. Like, I don't want to have multiple mURktides and have one get bounced and the second one just be completely dead. I kind of want to see one and that's it. Board out a Street Wraith and Street Wraith, Bloodchief Thirst, Fatal Push. I don't need the early interaction very much. Street Wraith comes out because my life total can be in jeopardy if they do resolve a Rhino. Board out a Brazen Borrower because there's really nothing that I want to bounce on their side. If they're on Leyline Binding, I'll likely leave Borrower in. But if they're not, I'm more than likely boarding it out. And then boarding out an Archmage's Charm on the draw because I don't want a 3-mana counterspell against a deck that is doing their thing on their turn 3. And then boarding in like 3 Flusterstorm, Mystical Dispute, 2 Chalice of the Void, EE, and 3 Flusterstorm, Mystical Dispute, 2 Chalice of the Void, EE. Yeah. So game 2 on the draw. Again, no lander. Throw that back. People ask a lot, like, Street Wraith and no landers, what do you have to see to keep it? And for me personally, I'll keep a no lander if I've got at least 2 Street Wraiths and I'm on the draw in a matchup where I know the turn 1 isn't like the end all be all. On the draw, 2 Wraiths. No turn 1 isn't the end all be all. And I've got something to do if I find my 1 mana. So, like, if I've got consider 2 Wraith, consider something like that, Spell Pierce, then I'll likely keep a no lander. But the last thing you want to do is keep a no lander that's got like 2 Wraiths and then counterspell, drown, Archmage's Charm, and it's like that first land isn't really doing anything for you. You have to hit multiple land drops off the top. So this is pretty good. Got Hand Disruption, got counterspells. Just throw back one of these extra lands. All right, so Borrower, Fire and Ice, Outburst. Let's just take the second set of Rhinos. If they want to Fire and Ice us here, that's fine. Looks like they're going to go for the EOT Fire and Ice. So I'm just going to consider. I don't think Fluster Storming it like really does much for me. I don't want to hold on to these Fluster Storms. And then I'm not considering into turn there because if they drew a Violent Outburst, I don't want to give them a window to resolve it. Obviously, if they had played like a tapped Shockland or something, I'd go for it, but they did not, so. Wasn't really expecting a Spyro there, but we'll take the opportunity to counter that. And then I'm going to pass to their turn. We've got Rhinos coming off Suspend, but I do have the ability to like consider Flusterstorm. But we just draw counterspell. So I like consider Flusterstorm. They pay Flusterstorm again just to get the Rhinos off. And essentially replace the 2 consider cards, use the 2 Flusterstorms to deal with the Rhinos. Alternatively, I could just like Fluster. But since we draw the counterspell, we're pretty okay with that too. And then same thing, I'm not tapping off of this fetch land or fetching at the end of their turn because if they have a Violent Outburst, they'd be able to sneak it through Flusterstorm right there. And I don't really want them doing that. Make a couple Spyro tokens. You got it. Keep a Drown in the Lock. Like, Shadow should be able to beat these tokens fairly well. So my goal is entirely like not putting myself in a position to die to Rhinos or have them like attack, I block, and they hard cast a Fury or something. So let's get a mURktide down. Cycle a Ketria Triome, which is fantastic for me. Then counter the Spyro. If they do have like, sure, I was gonna say if they did have like follow up land Rhinos, I could always Archmage's Charm to steal a Rhino on my turn. So I'm not like completely out of the water if they do. I didn't want to attack with a Shadow because I don't want them to just take it and then have like attack back for 5, and then they could have a what's it called, like a Prismari command or something to kill me on the backswing. Didn't really feel like a position I needed to put myself in. So let's just draw a couple. Okay, so I could have killed Seasoned Pyromancer there. I chose not to because I didn't want them to have this die and then be able to pay 5 and double up the bodies. So they would go from having 3 bodies on board or 4 bodies with the token to kill this, and then up to 5 with the Spyro. So they might be able to go around the Shadow. So that was the reasoning behind Fatal Pushing the token, even though I knew I had Revolt and could Fatal Push the Spyro. Alright, so they're going to throw out another Brazen Borrower. That's fine. A lot of this is just understanding that, like, bouncing the mURktide is annoying, but it's not winning them the game. So I don't want to waste counterspells on something that's not actually winning my opponent the game. And I think that's something that a lot of people that are picking up the deck kind of struggle with is, oh, I've got a counter spell. My opponent put something on the stack. I need to counter it. And so often that's not the case. Like, just because a counter spell is there, or just because a spell's on the stack and you have a counter spell, does not mean that you need to counter that spell. There's almost always something that puts you in a much worse position if you counter it. All right, so this was kind of an interesting turn. I drew the Fatal Push, which means that if my opponent flashes in a Brazen Borrower, if I attack with both and my opponent flashes in a Brazen Borrower, I can actually EE to blow away this token and then Fatal Push the what is it? Fatal Push the Seasoned Pyromancer, fetch and shock, and that puts me at exactly lethal. So we'll walk through as they do it, because of course we get lucky here. All right, so Brazen Borrower's got the text that it can only block creatures with flying. So I know it can't block the shadow. I can fetch and shock, put myself at 3 life, make the shadow a 10/10, blow up the EE to get rid of the elemental token, and then Fatal Push the Spyro. They don't have 5 mana to make tokens, and now I'm just presenting lethal with a mURktide and a shadow, and I've got 2 counter spells backed up to stop like a Dead and Gone, or in this case, a Violent Outburst. And yeah, that's all she wrote. So pretty fun way to end that game. But yeah, like if I throw out my counter spells early on those Dead and Gones or whatever, then I would have just been dead here. Because my opponent makes 2 Rhinos. They block the Borrower on the mURktide. They block a Rhino on the Shadow, and then untap, and they have a Rhino left to swing back with. But because we realized that those bounce effects and tap effects on the mURktide aren't actually killing us, then we could hold on to our counter spells and wait for an opportunity that we get to stop something that is actually killing us. So if you have any questions about what kind of things are or are not killing you in a matchup, I will have a link down below to the Control Freak Discord. You're welcome to come over, ask whatever you want to ask. I also have other videos on the YouTube channel, a whole matchup series where we talk about different decks and how to approach those matchups. And a lot of the times we do talk about, like, hey, this is your priority dealing with. This is annoying, but it's not a priority. So on the draw, no counter spells, 5 lands. Shipping this back pretty easy. This is better. It's not great, but it does have like threats. It's got a little bit of interaction. Misty for Steam Vents could mean mURktide. It could mean another Rhinos deck. Looks like mURktide to me. Some of the giveaways are like blue fetches, Ragavan, no, what's it called? No companion. Could have gone for end of turn Fatal Push on my opponent's turn, but I wanted to give myself an extra draw step to maybe hit like a Thoughtseize or a Spell Pierce or something. Because if they have one, I didn't know about the Dismember. I might have just put myself like in a position to not have any action. Also could have responded to them fetching by casting the Fatal Push, but I was thinking they were going to put like a Consider on the stack, and I want them to resolve the Consider before they know they don't have a Ragavan. So just some like minor little sequencing decisions. So we got another Ragavan, which we are going to end the life of because we want to be able to untap and get a shadow down. Otawara is an okay pickup. Means if we find a fourth land, we can just like bounce an opposing mURktide without needing a counter spell. Or not without needing a counter spell, without playing into a counter spell. All right. It could have a spell pierce, but I'm not going to pass up the opportunity to cast a Brazen Borrower. And let's just get a reasonably sized mURktide out there. Obviously, if our opponent's got Unholy Heat, it's rough. If they've got double Unholy Heat, it's rougher. So, pretty sure we're not winning this one. Yep. It's kind of that situation of I lose to double Unholy Heat, but I don't think it's right to just like hold on to the mURktide when it's the only thing that I can do and it's a very reasonable play. Like if they deal with one thing but not the other, I'm still in a really good position. They kind of have to deal with both, and they did. So be it. All right, sideboarding against mURktide. Bring in the 3 Flusterstorms, the 3 Ultimate Prices, the Engineered Explosives, and the Mystical Dispute. So 3 Flusterstorm, 3 Ultimate Price, 1 Mystical Dispute, 1 EE. Board out some Wraiths and Thoughtseizes because my life total is going to be in jeopardy. Thoughtseize, I really don't want to trade 1 mana or trade 1 spell for a deck that like 2 for 1 so much. And then Drowning Lock comes out, or 1 Drowning Lock comes out because of mURktide. But at the same time, they're running a whole bunch of 1 and 2 drop stuff. So I don't think Drown is like dead by any means. Good opening hand. Got an answer to Ragavan. We've got counter spells for everything after that. Eventually, we'll get down a shadow. And I want to go ahead and Fatal Push instead of Consider because I want to untap with counter magic up. Take lands because that allows us to get down shadow. And then that Street Wraith is actually a really, really nice draw because this lets us fight over a lot of stuff. Like if they go for an end of turn Bolt or Unholy Heat, we can cycle Street Wraith, save the shadow. And either make them like commit another spell to getting it off the board, or they just have to deal with we have a shadow. It looks like they want to commit over it, so we'll take that. So I'm not really sure what play or shock in third land pass represents. I mean, I guess that makes sense. So we'll take the opportunity to get 7 in there. Now, if they have like a fetch land or something, we get to deal with that. Petty theft, sure. Bouncing our shadow is a lot better than our shadow getting EE'd. So we'll take that exchange. Looks like a mURktide. Yep. All right. So definitely a position where we want to find a way to lose life so we can attack into this mURktide. We'll offer up the trade first because I would rather them just like block the shadow and I get to save my thirst. But because they decide not to block, we'll kick the thirst, deal with that. And now we've got just EE on 2, wipe up the Ledger Shredder, attack in. Even if they had like Spell Pierce or something to make us pay for the EE, we could just attack, force the block, and then play mURktide. So all roads leading to Rome there. So on to game 3. On the draw, it's really, really scary against mURktide. Again, because of Ragavan. No real sideboarding changes on the draw. And this is like why it's so scary against Ragavan. Like, I've got all the interaction in the world for everything after like turn 2. But if they have a Ragavan on 1, this hand gets so much worse. Yep. So top decking Shadow helps a little bit because this Ragavan does mean we get to play out a turn 2 Shadow. So they hit something that doesn't like really matter. And now we're kind of in a position where we could play out the Shadow, but it's just dead to so much that I don't really want to risk it. I think I'd rather have my opponent play out another turn here and hope I'm not too far behind. Counter Hearse, see if we can get them to like fight over this. Since they hadn't played a land drop before the Hearse, I was kind of assuming they didn't have a third land drop. So if they fired off this treasure token to fight over the Hearse and I could like Flusterstorm their counter spell or their Spell Pierce, whatever, then I would feel like I was in a really, really solid position despite staring down the turn 1 Ragavan. Then here it's just, all right, if it says interaction, I'm taking it. But opponent is untapping with 7 cards in hand. All right, so this is a really interesting sequence. So they start off with Lightning Bolt. Of course, I've fetched to save my Shadow from Lightning Bolt. In response, they Unholy Heat it. And then go for a second Unholy Heat. I get to Flusterstorm both the Unholy Heat and the original Lightning Bolt. So in hindsight, I think that I should have just gotten like a tapped land here and offered to trade the Shadow for the Ragavan because then they've got 4 cards. I've got 4 cards. I'm drawing up to 5. I've got my land drop. Like, I'm in a reasonable position. But we shocked, and they had Fury, Exile, and Expressive Iteration. One, I really don't know why they had Fury in post board. The only threats you've seen are mURktide and Shadow. And Fury's not particularly good against either of those. If they had Subtlety, I could understand that. And maybe they did, but I don't really know if I agree with Fury in post board. Maybe if you're treating it just as like, this is a threat. Possibly. But either way, they do get to attack us down to 5. We're just going to main phase, go to steal this Ragavan. Now it's our 3 cards in a Ragavan versus their 3 cards. We will absolutely fight over an iteration at this point. They kill the Ragavan, so now it's 2v2, 3v2, or 3v1 drawing up to 2. Nope. And it's really going to come down to whether or not we can find a threat before they find something something too good. Let the Shredder resolve. Catch a Dismember. Yep. Whole bunch of really, really exciting draw goes. I would just wait for somebody to find a threat. Like, we'll take more counter spells. I also don't know why they fetched there. There's no reason to go down below 13 life, especially when I've got this fetch out. Because this is representing if I have a shadow in protection, then it's just a 1-turn clock. And that is not where you want to be if you can avoid it. So consider into iteration. Decide to just let the iteration resolve. If they found a threat off of it, I could deal with whatever threat it was. If they don't find a threat, if they're just kind of like spinning wheels like this, that's fine for the most part. And we're just going to keep finding counter magic. Bolt me in the face. Don't like that. That makes me assume they've got a second bolt in hand. Hard cast a Fury. I don't particularly care for that either. Finally, we get to see our first glimpse of ultimate price. Yep. Is that like 3 considers in the last... All 4 considers in the last 2 turns. Looks like a mURktide. Yep. We got news for you. Alright, so hopefully Archmage's Charm is enough to kind of wrap this up. And opponent just makes us go to combat. So, nice little win over mURktide there. Ultimate price looked good dealing with that 8/8 mURktide. Everything kind of lined up reasonably well despite the turn 1 Ragavan. So, on to match number 3. So, match number 3 on the draw. No lands. We do have lands. Throw back the mURktide because we're not putting spells and cards in our grave very aggressively here. If we had like Thoughtseize and stuff, I'd be a lot more likely to keep the mURktide. But alas, we do not. Opponent does reveal Giganta. So Giganta Sacred Foundry makes me think like some sort of prowess deck. But then Sacred Foundry Stomping Ground. I have no idea. If it's prowess, I would assume they would have blue in there somewhere. Like, I have zero clue at this point what I'm up against. Cycle the dress down there because I really want to keep hitting land drops. Beseiju. So my thought is some sort of like Naya Urza Saga deck, because you could have like Ren and 6, Prismatic Ending, Tarmogoyf, and like Beseiju would make sense with Ren and 6. Throw out the Brazen Borrower so I can at least start attacking. And like Unholy Heat is another one that really makes me think it's some sort of like Naya Urza Saga deck. Naya Delirium. But that Flooded Strand wouldn't make a lot of sense with that. Could have played out a mURktide as a 5/5, but I'm a little bit afraid that if they've got a way of dealing with it, I could be in trouble. And then that kind of makes me happy that I didn't play out the mURktide, because now it's just looking like a 5-color pile deck, and they likely have Leyline Binding. But at the same time, I'm also a little bit afraid of like Tribal Flames now. But got to throw something out eventually. Yep. So we had the Leyline Binding call. Omnath, sure. So just some sort of like generic pile deck. Wasn't expecting Mana Leak. But either way, seen Omnath, we've seen Leyline Binding, so now we can at least confirm it's not like a zoo deck or something with like Tribal Flames. So all pretty good draws there. mURktide, counter spells. Leyline Binding, Mana Leak, yep. Didn't have Ice Fang Quaddle particularly high on my list. And then I have no idea why they didn't attack and then play Teferi and bounce the Ice Fang. So I'm working with as little information as y'all are. No. Yeah, so this is where things are getting a little out of hand. Just like, all right, we've got Omnath Teferi, expressive iteration in a turn. Here's a Ren. Yeah. Like, all right, I don't know. I'm assuming my opponent is somewhat familiar with their deck. I really, really hate the BM here, because I think this is just like trying to milk the clock. To me, this is like saying, I know you can't win in a certain amount of time, so I'm just going to drain as much time off the clock as possible in game one. Like, you've got a Ren and 6, you could just ping me twice. You've got a Ragavan, you could dash and I can't do anything. Like, just end the game. Don't sit there and be like all high and mighty trying to play over a few seconds of clock. Sideboarding. Boarded out a bunch of Fatal Pushes. Boarded out Blood Chief's Thirst. Mainly because being on the play, I'd rather counter Planeswalkers than try to deal with them after they've resolved. Boarded in one of the Flusterstorms. Boarded out a mURktide because we saw Teferi, Leyline Binding. I'm assuming they've got Solitude. And boarded in the two other Dress Downs, one Flusterstorm, Mystical Dispute, and the 3 Spreading Seas. Just to try to fight over mana a little bit. Alright, we Spreading Seas control now. So, hand is okay. Everything's just kind of a redraw. Take Ice Fang Quaddle, so they're more than likely not casting Expressive Iteration on turn 2, regardless of what I do. But they would flash in an Ice Fang Quaddle, and they'd be able to with Spreading Seas. So if I want to seize like this Zeatoro's Proving Ground on turn 2, then I kind of want to take them off of their turn 2 play. If they want to spend their turn 2 like Prismatic ending the Express or the Spreading Seas, that's fine with me. I just want to hit land drops. All right. So this is actually kind of a funny turn because I get the opportunity to Thoughtseize here. As we can see, they've got the Expressive Iterations and the Mystic or Prismatic Endings, Mystical Dispute. If you see the line, feel free to pat yourself on the back because it's really funny. If we take this Mystical Dispute, it means we get to for sure resolve a Spreading Seas. If we take out the Sacred Foundry, they no longer have red for Iteration or white for Prismatic Ending. So we effectively cut them off of 4 cards in their hand unless they draw another land. That one is not a land that helps them out. So I thought that was really funny. Just that their whole hand kind of like hinged on a red-white land, and they happen to have one out. Now we're just cutting them off black mana. And we're just going to sit here and hold up some sort of counter spell. All right. Seju's themselves. I'm guessing they realized when they did this that I would get the land and I could just shock in another Watery Grave. That makes both of my shadows lethal. So they can no longer just like kill one dude. But they should have Beseju'd this one. This third one over here, the Sacred Foundry, to be able to Prismatic Ending a shadow. Why they went for Beseju on the tapped land, I don't know. But regardless, going to game 3 on the draw, it's really rough. It's not a particularly easy matchup by any means. Opening hands, reasonable. We've got turn 2 Shadow, Dress Down, Drown in the Lock. So let's go for a Thoughtseize. Opening hand is not very good with Ren and Omnath and some lands. So we're going to push our lack of advantage and hope it's able to get there. Yuck. So they drew Mystical Dispute, Shadow Prophecy. We'll just take the Omnath. And they're going to main phase a Shadow Prophecy. I'm assuming looking for a Leyline Binding or a Prismatic Ending. I'm not really sure why they did this or did that on their main phase when they could have done it on my turn, but either way, in like an okay spot here. Not a great one, but yeah, they just found a second copy of Mystical Dispute, so that's pretty rough for us. Main phase the dress down just to try to find a threat I can get out on the field. Yeah. And this is kind of an issue that's plagued Grixis Shadow for ages, like the old school Grixis Shadow decks, is that you are very, very prone to flooding. And it can make life very, very awkward sometimes. I don't know why they're not attacking here. Like, I can't imagine you're afraid of a hasty threat or something. And if they do attack, I probably need to flash in the Borrower and go down to or to block. But really, I just like have to find some sort of a card advantage spell. Like, all right, it's not horrendous. So I can counterspell this Gigantha on the way back down and flash in Borrower to block the Ice Fang. Obviously, they can have an answer to the Borrower, which they do. I was kind of surprised at how many counterspells they had, but I guess it makes sense. Also, they were running Gigantha, so they had to have cut like the pitch elementals. I don't know if Shadow Prophecy is worth cutting the pitch elementals, but I don't play these decks, so I'm not really sure. You do get Leyline Binding still, so maybe. But either way, game number 3, or that was game number 3. Tough matchup. On to match 4. Decent enough opening hand. We've got an answer to like a turn 1 Ragavan. All right, Gilded Goose. So some sort of food deck. Decided not to go for the Fatal Push on the Goose because I drew the Spell Pierce. So that'll allow me to fight over something like this, like a cookbook, like a finale for an Asmo. And now that I don't see a second land, I'm 100% killing the Goose. Which, of course, leads to a top deck land. I had to read this card a few times. So, Sarenth Steel Seeker. 1 and a green. Whenever an artifact enters the battlefield under your control, look at the top card of your library. If it's a land, you can reveal it, put it into your hand. If you don't put it into your hand, you can put it into the graveyard. But it triggers every time an artifact enters, not just the first time. So that's kind of cool with like multiple cookbooks and the Oval Chase Daredevil. So I do have a finale. Go ahead and get some value out of our counter spell. Then I probably should have been mana efficient and just gone ahead and like fatal push this dude. So if I drew the land, I could play Shadow, hold up Charm, no issue. Trail of Crumbs is like whenever you sacrifice a food, you get to look at the top 2 cards of your library. You can reveal a permanent, put it into your hand. Otherwise, it goes to the bottom. Yeah. But ultimately, I kind of decided that like Trail of Crumbs and Sarenth Steel Seeker are like cool little value pieces, but they're not game-ending pieces. So I'm just going to kind of let them ride. Play out Shadow, play out a mURktide. Hold up Fatal Push. Really like holding Fatal Push for Asmo. Speak of the devil. Good old Asmorano, mURktide, Stina Kuldakar. But we don't have to get to that. We just get to show our big beefy dudes. That's enough to take game number 1. Sideboarding. Boarded in EE. Boarded in Dress Downs. Because Dress Down can shut down Asmo, Gilded Goose. Shuts down that dude for a turn. Didn't board in Ultimate Price because it does not hit Asmorano, mURktide, Stina Kuldakar. Unfortunate, I know. Brazen Barber comes out because like everything in their deck is basically an ETB effect or something, so it doesn't really matter if I bounce anything. Could bounce like a cookbook and try to get it on the way down, but I think I'd rather just rely on EE. Boarded in... What did I say? Dress Downs. Oh, Spreading Seas to help fight over Urza's sagas. Dress Downs for like not only shutting off the dudes, but the saga tokens. Then the EE boarded out like Wraiths and a couple Thought Seizes because they're pretty redundant, pretty resilient to hand hate. Just very repetitive. And it's likely to come down to where my life total matters, especially if they're running like Witch's Oven and Cauldron Familiar. Opening hand is terrible. Get out of here. It's better. So I've got like a 1-mana interactive spell. I've got Consider to help me find another land. Throw back the Dress Down because I'd rather... It's between the Dress Down and the mURktide Regent. And I'd rather keep like the known threat at the moment. So kill off the Goose, kind of thinking maybe they got greedy again. But they Thought Seize away my Consider, which is very unfortunate for us. And we draw all of our 2-mana counter magic. Yeah. This is what we call pretty dead. Get back double Feasting Troll King. Yeah, we just never see a second land. So certainly the downside of relying on a card like Consider to get you out of a bind. But we do get to go to game 3 on the play. And that's really, really nice. Opening hand's terrible. We've got 4 black cards we can't cast. This is better. Just throw back an island because it doesn't lose its life for this Shadow. Got a Goose on turn 1 again. Nope, Just turn 1, Asmarana, mURktide, Sina Kuldakar. That is definitely going to eat a Fatal Push. But it does mean they get down a Cookbook turn 2. Double Cookbook. Go ahead and fire off this this Dress Down. I know I'm not casting the mURktide this turn. Could have fired off second main phase. I don't think it really matters. All right. So we call this opponent getting greedy with their Nihil Spellbomb. We Thoughtseize, see Grist, Fatal Push, Forest, and the Finale. Take the Finale so they can't get another Asmo, because that would 100% kill our mURktide Regent. Playing the land first doesn't matter. I don't want to play the land and fetch, because that gives a priority opportunity for Spellbomb. So we're just going to play out the mURktide and say go. And now, hopefully, if they like find a threat and try to go like Underworld Cookbook, ditch a card, play Asmo, play Grist to have something to sack to mURktide, we could just Fatal Push. But I don't think they got it. Keep a Drown, kill a Grist. There you go. Now they've got Daredevil loops, but Fatal Push is gone. Grist is gone. Their last 2 cards are Forest Unknown. I can kill these Saga tokens really well. Could play the second mURktide here to exile the Consider, grow this one by 1, and make it a 2-turn clock. But then I'd have to deal with like these really big construct tokens and just do a chump block. So if my opponent like made a construct, untapped, made a construct, got a Shadow Spear, I would just be dead. Like I'd be jumping with a mURktide. They'd gain way too much life. So instead, I'm going to sit on my removal spells. Go ahead and kill this one so they don't get to untap with it in case they have like Veil of Summer. Didn't have Haywire Might on my radar. Maybe that's on me. So I have to remember that they can sack Haywire Might, like destroy their own thing, gain 2 life. Or what they could do when they untap is like sack Haywire Might, target one of their food tokens. Or is it non-token? Oh, it is non-creature artifact or non-creature. Yeah, so they can sack and target one of their food tokens. And then in response, sack the food token. They gain 3 off this, 2 more off the Haywire Might. Here, I just want to get like biggest swing possible in. Because I know my opponent can gain 6 life next turn. So if I attack for 5, hold up counterspell, next turn mURktide, it's not really like getting me ahead at all. And they look for some stuff. I don't know what their out there was, because this only puts lands into hand. They didn't have a redraw. If they found like a Feasting Troll King or something, it doesn't have reach. So I don't know if they actually had an out or if they were just drawing for the sake of drawing. Either way, on to match number 5. On the play. Love being on the play. On the play with a not great hand, but we'll see. We do have like turn 1 interaction for both fair and unfair. Bloodstained Mire, go. I have no idea what that implies. No companion, so it's probably not like Grixis Shadow. Marsh Flats for Plains, so Mardu something. Priest of Fellrights. Alright, so Mardu Reanimator. That means that my life total is not particularly in jeopardy. Because they're either going to win or lose through like some big payoff. So it's likely not going to matter if I'm at 10 life or 3 life. Like the big thing is going to kill me one way or the other. So Nahiri the Unforgiving. Cool to see this getting played. So they could tick up and loot. They could 0 and exile the priest, but they don't have anything to reanimate with it. More than likely, this would just serve as like a fog for Shadow. But getting it into the yard means I get to add a 5th card to their yard. So now Drown in the Loch is countering most everything I care about. Would have countered that anyway, but... Alright, so I had to decide between like holding up Charm, getting down mURktide. I could have had myself draw 2 and maybe try to find like a fetch land to grow Shadow, then play mURktide. But I kind of decided the clock off mURktide is more important. Like at the moment, if they do have a persist or something, they don't have any great targets, just the Spyro. If they don't have a persist, I'm not really afraid of like a Nahiri here. So we're just going to get down this and hope. Uh-oh. We fucked up. We fucked up. Oh, they don't have anything. Thank God. All right. I just want to say, I thought this was like the funniest turn in the world. Opponent was at 13 life. If I'd remembered this turn was here, I would have dramatically slow rolled it a lot better. Opponent's at 13 life. We got a 1/1 Shadow and a mURktide, so 7 points of power. We draw a Street Wraith, cycle it. We're now at 9 points of power. We draw another Street Wraith, cycle it. We're at 11 points of power. We draw into 3rd Street Wraith, cycle it. We're now up to exactly 13. Swinging for lethal with an Archmage's Charm back up. And I thought that was like the highlight sequence of the entire league. But, you know, it don't always be like that, but sometimes it do. Sideboarding, bringing in... I brought in 1 Flusterstorm. Since it doesn't stop like Nahiri or Priest, I was a little skeptical about it. But it does stop Unmarked Grave, Persist. Didn't bring in ultimate prices because ultimately if they get their big thing, they're going to win. I see people a lot of the times bringing in like Terminates and Dress Downs and whatever against Archon decks. And personally, I'm not a big fan of that because I think if the thing lands, you lose the game. Like, if Archon comes down, stacks your Shadow or your mURktide or whatever, draws a card for them, makes you ditch a card, you lose 3, they gain 3, and then you terminate the Archon and put it right back in their graveyard, you're probably not in a position to come back from that. So I would usually rather lean on things that help stop that from happening. Board out Borrower, because a bunch of ETB effects, as well as like not really having a priority opportunity against things like Priest. Board out a couple Fatal Push, because they miss everything big and they don't really do anything against the small stuff. Boarded in Dress Downs, mainly because they shut off Spyro and Priest of Fell Rights and stuff like that. Not so much because they shut off like an Archon trigger for a turn. Because if you do that, your opponent still just has an Archon. And you're probably not beating them just having an Archon in play. Even if you stifle that one trigger. Alright, so not a great opening hand. Like, we can stifle them for a bit. We need to find counter spells, but I really have a hard time throwing back a hand with just like functional number of lands, sideboard cards, and threats. So let's consider our options. Decided to just hold up Drown instead of going for a Bloodchief's Thirst, because if my opponent does cast like some spell that puts something in the yard, then I can kill the Priest. They go for Spyro, so I get my Dress Down value. Feels good. Then I always love those, the like, oh, you're above 13 life, I'm just not going to attack. It's like, I think if you're playing against Death Shadow, and your opponent is above 13 life, just attack. And I say that because their entire deck is less so the new Shadow decks, but like a lot of Shadow decks, a lot of dedicated Shadow decks. If Shadow is an integral part of their game plan, their deck is designed to get down below 13 life. Like, you holding off on an attack for a turn is not stopping that. Like, hey, you kept me from going down to 12. I'm still gonna Thoughtseize to 12 and then fetch Shock to 9. Like, your lack of attack there didn't stop any of that. So the double Spyro getting Dressed Down is pretty fun. There again, the no attack because they don't want shadows online. Like, if I'm fetching up a basic there, it's because I'm assuming you're going to attack, and if you don't, I've got a way to compensate. So Grief and Ephemerate, pretty reasonable, but we get out a mURktide. We could have held up Counterspell for Grief, but I don't think I really care if my opponent griefs here. They take second mURktide. They take Counterspell. Get rid of that. Like, if they had taken the attacks earlier, I would be dead here. They were attacking for 7 right there. They skipped 4 points of attacks. So, yet again, just attack. Like, you're really not doing yourselves a lot of favors by letting the shadow player control their life total more. But either way, that was match number 5. Ended up a little 4-1. So some options that I would consider. Most of this list is geared towards what I'm expecting to see in the ManaTraders event. So, like the extra Fluster Storms, the extra Spreading Seas, the Ultimate Price, all geared for like mURktide, Amulet Titan, 4-color piles, Creativity, Rhinos, the extra Chalice in there for a lot of these Living In and Rhinos decks that I saw through the qualifiers. So keep that in mind if you're thinking about running the list, is you might want to move some of these to more open options, like cut a Fluster Storm and a Spreading Seas for some unlicensed hearses if you're going into the Magic Online leagues, because you're more likely to run into like an open meta than you are very specific opponents. But other than that, yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video. Should be up pretty shortly. And have a fantastic rest of your day. Adios for now.